The story begins in 1943 when somebody who went on to become Rodney Dawson was a baby born to a farming family in Lincolnshire. The family, Dawsons, owned and farmed over 1,000 acres of UK's breadbasket. Lincolnshire wheat was essentially their farming business. Rodney grew up and in his young teens became a very keen and enthusiastic birdwatcher. And he didn't really have a mentor, it was just something in him, not his family. He also, in his late teens, early 20s, became fascinated by wildfowl and keeping wildfowl in captivity, digging ponds on the farm, putting a fence around to keep out the foxes, and acquiring, to start with, British wildfowl, ducks and geese, but then moving on and becoming interested in what you could call exotic wildfowl from around the world. He, because of that interest, started visiting the Wildfowl Trust at Slimbridge, which is where I was working, and I met him for the first time there. He married a girl called Jane, who was living not far from their farm, and that's how they just met casually, probably in a pub. And his other interest, which again wasn't typical for a farmer's son in Lincolnshire, was cattle. And there's not much room on a big arable farm for cattle. Furthermore, it's not a good place to keep cattle because you've got to winter them, have big sheds and barns and things like that. So Rod's interest was rather, again, what the farm family was doing, his father and his younger brother, and particularly digging ponds was beginning to grate with the family, because every spare bit of ground, the digger moved in, it filled with water and ducks. So in 1972, he spotted an advert for what was then known as the Ellister estate, which is about 7,000 acres of the Rins, starting at, I suppose, Craigfad, right the way down to part of the village of Port Weems and everything in between, more or less on both sides of the Rins. So they decided to buy it, and Rod and Jane moved up here after the Ellister farmhouse had been put into a habitable state. It was actually lived in, but if you went in the kitchen at that time, there was an open drain running through the middle of the kitchen from the farmyard on one side to a burn on the other. So the kitchen was not a particularly nice place. However, digging ponds at Ellister was a great thing. There was plenty of room. There are still sizable ponds, almost a small lake on the left-hand side of the road, all of which dates from Rod's enthusiasm and knowledge of keeping wildfowl. I was visiting Islay through the 60s and 70s, usually 2 or 3 times every winter, to count the geese. There weren't resident goose counters at that time. I was still based at Slimbridge. And I would stay with them at Ellister on occasion. And everything was going absolutely swimmingly until in 1976, Rod was diagnosed with a horrendously aggressive cancer. And he died in 1977, aged just 34. Jane had a 1-year-old and a 4-year-old daughter and decided to stay here and to rear them. They went to Porthaven School and to carry on with the ducks, and was already, the two of them were successfully breeding some quite rare duck species. And Jane carried on doing that and was the first to breed king eiders in the world, and be successful at long-tail ducks and things like that. She persuaded the trustees who wanted to sell the estate as a one. The family had installed trustees, and she, remembering conversations with Rod, didn't like the idea of the whole estate being sold. And the trustees were persuaded to let every tenant, whether of a farm or a cottage in Port Weems, to buy their property for 20 years' rent, which was extremely generous. And bank loans were easy in those days if you needed it. And it was the most generous offer. And the trustees were satisfied. They got enough money to fulfill their purpose in life, which was to maximize the financial basis. Jane gradually, not instantly, thought, I want to do something to remember Rod by. And he was a natural conservationist. He didn't have to read about it or study it. He just knew that you had to conserve things. And she thought, well, there's this wonderful natural history of wildlife of Islay. We don't want it to be active conservation. There are other organizations doing that. But what about setting up a charity which would encourage the study and the enjoyment of Islay's natural history? And that was the first aim, and it's still the aim on the trust deed of the Natural History Trust. I was visiting her, and she set up the trust in 1984, hence this is the 40th year, with the aid of 4 trustees, friends from East Anglia. There was Professor Norman Moore, who was an absolute expert in dragonflies and damselflies, the Odonata. I visited him. He had a pond in his large garden, and he'd recorded something like 16 species in this well-grown pond outside Cambridge. There was Chris Taylor, who was a regular bird-watching visitor here and was bursar of a Cambridge college. And there was Ron Hickling, who was a neighbour in Lincolnshire, very keen and serious birdwatcher, and ended up as president of the British Trust for Ornithology for a spell of 2 or 3 years. And the 4th trustee was Dr. Tate in Bruichladdich, the local GP, whom Jane had got to know inevitably with ring children and any other illnesses, and of course with Rod's death. So those were the first 4 trustees in 1984. Then in 1985, she was beginning to gel the idea of what was to be called a field centre. I was staying with her in autumn 85. She had bought a house just opposite the hotel, which was converted into accommodation for 14 people. And the downstairs, which had been a little grocery shop, there were 2 rooms, just with a wider passage between them. And that became the beginnings of the displays that have grown so much here. And the old lady whose shop it was and who had retired sold newspapers. And rather than pass them to the village shop up the road, she thought, well, if I carry on the newspaper business, it'll bring the locals in and they'll begin to see what it is. Anyway, in this conversation I had with her in November 85, she said, I'm thinking I need someone to act as a director, to get it off the ground, to actually physically bring the trust into being with its field centre. And she looked at me, and my wife and I had been visiting Islay since the 60s. Our older daughter's called Islay, nothing to do with being here 9 months before she was born. And we had always thought, well, if we could find something to do, living on Islay would be a perfect thing to do. And Jane said, I can provide you with money for 5 years to keep your head above water. And by then, I would hope you, Malcolm, would have the trust self-sustaining. So that was how I came to live here, having been visiting for 25 years before that, and how the trust and the Natural History Trust and its centre came into being.